Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Good morning. Today I would like to talk to you about lesson planning. Last year during my training year, my single greatest source of stress, beyond behaviour management, university essays, commuting, was lesson planning. It pushed me to the edge, and on one occasion, I'd say pushed me clean over the edge. This year, however, it's not so bad. It's still hard work, but I no longer find it so stressful. I made a few changes that I think made a big difference, and today I thought I'd share those changes with you. First though, I'd like to make a quick argument in favour of planning a week's worth of lessons all in one go, or most of a week's worth of lessons all in one go, in advance. And so that usually means doing a fair bit of work, or doing some work anyway, at the weekend. The alternative approach would be to plan each day at a time. And that would usually mean planning the evening before and the morning of that day. I, however, think it's better to plan a week's worth all in one go and in advance. So, first, it allows you to see what the week looks like for each of your classes. It gives you a slightly bigger picture than just considering each day at a time. And it gives you a better sense of direction, I think. Second, I think it's more efficient. I think it's more efficient to plan a week's worth of lessons for a class all in one go than to plan a day at a time. Because each day you'll teach several different classes, several different year groups. They'll all be doing different things. And it can be harder to keep track of where you are with each of those classes. Each time you come to plan a new day, you'll have to remind yourself of how far you got the day before, what point you're up to. Whereas if you plan a week's worth all in one go, at no point do you have to remind yourself of how far you've gotten, of what you're doing, because you're doing it all in one fell swoop. I think it's much more efficient. So it may take more time initially, but I think it saves time over the course of the week. And I think that leads me to the third reason I favour planning a week's worth of lessons in advance, as opposed to planning day by day. It frees up time in the week. If you've done most of your planning at the weekend, say, you'll have more time during the week and more capacity during the week to think about other things. And I think that's crucial because as a teacher, one task after another seems to get piled on, often unexpectedly. Now, if you're already at maximum capacity just planning your lessons, then those additional tasks may be the straws that break the camel's back, so to speak. But if you've done the bulk of the planning at the weekend, then you'll have more room to manoeuvre in the week and address any concerns or additional tasks or any admin as and when it arises. So I really do favour the approach of planning a week's worth of lessons in advance. And that's always been the approach that I've favoured. Last year, however, and this was the fatal mistake, I tried to do too much all at once. Planning a week's worth of lessons is a big task, and I would try to do it all on a Sunday. It required a lot of work, a lot of thinking, a lot of stress, and if I hadn't been particularly productive in the first few hours Sunday morning, I'd start to worry. Say if I'd only planned a lesson or two in the first hour or so, I would start to think, well, you've still got 10 more left to go. There aren't enough hours left in Sunday to get that all done. and you'll be doing nothing today except planning. What a miserable thought that is. And then other intrusive thoughts would start to sneak in, and I'd think, the kids won't even care. They don't want to be in school, let alone do they want to be in maths. And then I start to think, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? And so it was a very quickly a downward spiral. And I don't think those intrusive thoughts were true, by the way. I do think kids want to be in school, and I do think they want to learn maths. So that happened on a couple of occasions last year, and it caused me quite a bit of stress. But like I said, I was trying to do too much all at once. This year, I have broken the task of planning a week's worth of lessons down into 4 subtasks. The first task is to decide what you are teaching. So I'll just speak briefly about timetables. So last year I always had your typical sort of teaching timetable. It would have the days of the week across the top and the periods of the day down the left-hand side. And that timetable would tell me who I was teaching, so which class, when I was teaching them, which period, and where I was teaching them, which room. This year I have an extra timetable, still with the days of the week across the top, but down the left-hand side I have each of my classes. And it's on this timetable where I plan what I'm teaching each week. It's a much better way to keep track of it, and this may be something you've done all along. But for me, last year I tried to keep track of most of it in emails, which didn't work very well, and I ended up trying to track most of it in my head, which was too much. So now I plan what I'm teaching in this additional weekly timetable where I can track what each of my classes are doing day to day. That's the first task when it comes to planning a week's worth of lessons, deciding what you're going to teach. And I do that on a Friday afternoon after school. I decide what I'm going to teach the following week. And the reason I do it on a Friday afternoon after school is because that week, the week that's just finished, is still fresh in my mind. And that makes it easier to decide what I'm going to teach next week. And it probably takes me 15 minutes or so, 15-20 minutes. And when it comes to planning a week's worth of lessons, deciding what you're going to teach arguably requires the most thought. Actually, I tell a lie. I think one of the other components requires more thought, but I'll get to that in a moment. So the first task is deciding what to teach. I make those decisions on a Friday afternoon after school, and I put them into my weekly class timetable. Then on a Sunday, I plan the main bodies of my lessons for each of my classes, and I do a class at a time. So I plan the main bodies of the lessons for my Year 7 class, for example, for the whole week. Then I do my Year 8, then I do my Year 9s. And I should clarify what I mean by the main body. So I feel that a lesson is composed of a starter and the main body. And in maths, that main body typically involves I do, we do, you do. I run through a few examples, then we'll do some together so that I can assess for learning. And then you go off and have a go at some on your own. So that's the main body of the lesson. And that's what I plan on a Sunday. I just plan my main bodies. I don't try to plan my starters, and I think this was a fatal flaw last year. Last year on a Sunday, I would try to plan my starters and my main bodies and my homeworks sequentially. So I'd go starter, main body, starter, main body, starter, main body, homework. The issue with trying to do that was that I would have to try and make some quite accurate predictions as to how far I would get through the content by each lesson so that I knew what to put in my starters. So my starters are typically recap starters. But of course you can only plan a recap starter once you know how far you've gotten. And so on a Sunday, I was trying to predict how far I'd get. And that required a lot of unnecessary brain power. Similarly with the homework. You can only plan a homework once you know how much you've taught the kids. If you try to plan a homework a week in advance, it's quite hard because you have to really think hard about what you'll have taught them up until that point, the point at which you set the homework. And that would kill all momentum. So last year when I was trying to plan starters, main bodies and homeworks all on a Sunday afternoon, each time I'd get to a starter, I'd have to stop and try and figure out how far I would have gotten. But this year, I just do the main bodies. For each class, for each lesson of the week, I plan the I do, we do, you do part. And now that I don't have to stop and think about starters, I can blast through it really quickly. And it doesn't require a great deal of thought either. My favourite resource is Corbett Maths. And typically, for each type of question that I want to teach that lesson, I will snip an exercise from a Corbett Maths worksheet. Then I'll separate the top row of questions from the rest, and I'll use the top row as my I do, we do. And once I've done my I do, we do, I will reveal the rest of the questions within that exercise, which the kids will do on their own. That's the you do part. And so yes, I just repeat the process over and over for each type of question I want to address that week. And I can do it quickly. I can do it pretty quickly. And I'd say now I can plan the main body of a week's worth of lessons in around 3 hours. Now I know that still sounds like quite a lot, and I'm sure there are better things you could be doing with that time on a Sunday. But I think that this is just the nature of being an early career teacher. I'm now at a stage where once I've planned a lesson, I feel I won't need to plan it again. I'm happy enough with my lessons now. So next year, I'll have to plan fewer lessons. The year after that, I'll have to plan fewer lessons still. So soon enough, I think I'll be able to reclaim my Sundays. Okay, so what have we spoke about so far? I decide what I'm going to teach on a Friday afternoon after school. I plan the main body of my lessons on a Sunday for the week ahead. And then during the week, I plan my starters and my homeworks. And as far as planning starters and homeworks are concerned, I feel that they're pretty much the same thing. So often a homework will be very similar to a starter that they've had in the week, but just with different numbers. And also, on the day that the homework's due, going through the answers for the homework and marking it as a class will be the starter exercise. So I do that. I do my homeworks and my starters before school and during my frees. And that doesn't take long at all. Like, it doesn't take up all that time. I do other things before school and during my frees as well. Now, the final thing that I usually think about on the day, or in the days leading up to the lesson, is the why of the lesson. So for each and every lesson we teach, we have to ask ourselves, why are we teaching it? Why should our students bother learning it? And that can require some thought. But again, I don't try to do it on a Sunday at the weekend. I do it in the week. Often I'll speak to colleagues. For an example of this, I taught bid maths last week with my year 8s. So bid maths being brackets, indices, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. And bid maths tells you the order in which you should perform those operations. For example, multiplication before addition. So if you have 1 plus 2 times 3, you should do your 2 times 3 first and then add your 1. So your answer would be 7. 2 times 3 is 6, add 1 is 7. Your answer is not 1 plus 2, which equals 3, times 3, which would be 9. That would be incorrect according to BidMaths. You've done your operations the wrong way around. And so, for each of my lessons, I insert a blank slide after my starter. And that's where I have this discussion about the point of that day's lesson, why it should be learned. And so for that bid mass lesson, I put something like 1 + 2 × 3 up on the board and asked the kids to work out the answer. Some of them got 7, some of them got 9. I then said, this is a problem. In maths, there should only be one answer. Imagine if you were doing bookkeeping and trying to keep track of how much someone owed you, and you said one amount, but they said something different. Chaos would ensue. And so what we need is a set of rules that we all agree upon, which would guarantee that we all get the same answer. And that set of rules is BidMass. So for that lesson, that was my why. Why should you bother learning this? To put it in a different way, you need to create an intellectual need for your lesson. So that's what that blank slide is about. And that requires a bit of thought. But I rarely do that thinking on my own. I'll often consult more experienced colleagues. Okay, so to recap this episode, I think there are some serious advantages to planning a week's worth of lessons in advance. But to try to plan an entire week's worth of lessons all in one go can be a serious problem. It can just be too much. And so the task needs to be broken down, and I think it can be broken down into 4 components. The first task, decide what you're going to teach. I do that on a Friday afternoon after school. Second, plan the main bodies of your lessons and do so a class at a time. That's the second task. The third task is to plan whatever else goes into a lesson. So in maths, it would be your starters and your homeworks. Those are the things that tend to frame the main body. So you need to plan the frame, but I don't attempt to do that on a Sunday because it would slow me down and kill momentum. Instead, I do that in the week, either the morning before the lesson or during a free, something like that. And that way I know exactly what to include in my starters and in my homework because I know how far we've gotten. If I try to predict that at the weekend on a Sunday, again, that kills momentum and it uses far too much brain power and you're bound to get it wrong. And the fourth and final thing to plan is the why of each lesson. How are you going to generate that intellectual need? And again, that's something I think about in the week. So the moral of the story is, when you're confronted with a big, scary, complicated task, like the task of planning a week's worth of lessons in advance, break it down into discrete subtasks and don't attempt to complete all of those subtasks all in one go. Otherwise, there was no point in breaking it down to begin with. So break the problem down into smaller, easier problems to solve, and then do each one of them in different sittings. And I don't know how this didn't occur to me sooner, because I'd say that that's one of the most valuable lessons that maths teaches us. And I spoke about it in my PGCE interview last year. Maths teaches us how to break a big, scary problem down into smaller, easier problems. And that lesson doesn't just apply to mathematics, it applies to everyday life. So I'm ashamed to say I didn't implement this approach sooner. But you know what? I think I was really suffering with decision fatigue. And that's something that will afflict all new trainee teachers at some point. You have so many decisions to make, and so often, that it can be exhausting even making the most trivial of decisions, let alone having the wherewithal to stop, take a step back and ask yourself whether you're making life harder for yourself, whether you're doing things in the most efficient way. So I guess I shouldn't be too hard on myself. Some time passed between recording and publishing this episode, and on listening to it back, I think I've failed to address 2 quite important questions, which I'll do here. First, I said that the task of planning a week's worth of lessons can be broken down into 4 subtasks, the first of which being deciding what you're going to teach. But I failed to address the question of how you make that decision. Well, you do so in accordance with a scheme of learning, which should be provided by your department, and which should align with the national curriculum. So my department provides a scheme of learning which says what units we are to teach over which periods. Each of those units has a unit assessment at the end. I look at the unit assessment and work backwards to decide what I'm going to teach in each lesson. And my overarching goal within each unit is for each of my students to do as well as they possibly can on that unit assessment. I want my students to experience as much success as possible. So that was the first question. I also spoke about framing the main body of the lesson. So the main body of the lessons I like to plan on a Sunday, and then I said that I would plan whatever else goes into a lesson, the frame of the lesson as I put it, during the week. And I referred to starters and homeworks, but nothing else. And so you may have thought, what about a plenary? Surely that is the final part of the lesson, after the main body. And I agree with you, but I think that the most valuable plenary in maths is simply going through the answers. So the main body involves I do, we do, you do. And then once they've finished having a go themselves, once that you do period comes to an end, I run through some answers and I address any common misconceptions on the board. That's the plenary. And I would do that, I would run through that whole process for each type of question that I'm addressing that lesson. So that may happen 2 or 3 times throughout a lesson. Now, I'm sure there are other things you could do for a plenary in mathematics. And sometimes I do them. Sometimes I'll do a bonus question as well, which will perhaps involve applying whatever mathematical skills they've learnt that day to a real life scenario. Maybe, but not always. I think the most important plenary when it comes to teaching maths is going through the answers and addressing any common misconceptions. So those were 2 questions that occurred to me when I listened back to this episode. If any other questions occur to you, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Now, on the topic of productivity, I was recently contacted by a prospective sponsor called Magic Mind, who sent me a box of their productivity shots. Each productivity shot contains matcha green tea, which apparently gives you energy, adaptogens, which help you relax, nootropics, I think that's how you say that word, which keep you focused, and honey, which apparently makes you happy. And they said that to feel the full effect of these productivity shots, I should have a shot a day for at least 5 consecutive days. So that's what I did from Tuesday to Saturday. Now, I think concerns about productivity only arise for those people who are privileged enough to have time to procrastinate. And that ain't teachers. Teachers can't procrastinate. You can't put off a lesson until tomorrow. You just need to get it done. So I'm not sure whether productivity is a real issue, but even so, I gave these productivity shots a try for 5 days on the bounce. And when I was at school, Tuesday to Friday, I have to say I didn't notice much. I was very tired this week for different reasons. And of course I was as busy as ever at school. And so I didn't really notice a difference in the way I was feeling. So the idea is that you're meant to take these shots with your usual caffeinated drink, and they will enhance the benefits, make you even more productive, whilst mitigating any negative side effects. Anxiety, for example. Now, I stopped having coffee at school precisely for that reason. I found that it made me anxious. I mean, it would certainly give me a boost, a noticeable one at that. But it would come with feelings of anxiety, and sometimes that was enough to kind of tip me over into the red zone as far as anxiety is concerned. So I stopped having caffeine a while ago at school. So this week I tried the productivity shots instead, and like I said, I didn't really notice much. But I feel that, all things considered, I didn't really give them a fair trial. So on Saturday, I decided to have quite a strong coffee on an empty stomach, which would usually be more than enough to make me anxious. But I had a magic mind shot alongside it, just to see what would happen. Sure enough, I felt more focused, but I didn't experience the increase in anxiety, which is interesting. And so perhaps that was thanks to the Magic Mind productivity shot. I'll continue trialing them myself, but if you're someone like me who appreciates the benefits of a caffeinated drink, but perhaps also suffers some side effects like anxiety, then maybe these Magic Mind shots could help you too. So if you're interested, I'll leave a link to Magic Mind in the show notes. And there's also a discount code. So the discount code is Brown20. And if you enter that code at checkout, you will get 40% off within the next 10 days. So the discount code is always good for at least 20% off, but within the next 10 days, you'd get 40% off. Okay, so if you're interested, go and check it out. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you might have found it useful. It took around 2.5 hours to produce, which is about average, and I tried to produce 2 to 3 episodes a month. So that's around 6.5 hours in total. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3 a month, then please consider becoming a patron. As always, I'll leave a link to my Patreon page in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.